There is a fundamental misunderstanding that most people carry, one so deeply embedded in how we talk about love, connection, and belonging that almost no one stops to question it. And it has been costing you more than you realize. People tend to believe that when someone always reaches out to you, always needs you, always says you are the only one they can truly open up to, that is love, that is intimacy, that is proof that you matter to them in a way that goes beyond ordinary connection. But that is not what it is. What most people fundamentally misunderstand is this. There is a profound, painful, and almost invisible difference between someone loving you and someone being addicted to the healing you provide. From the outside, these two things look nearly identical. Both involve constant presence. Both produce the words, "I don't know what I would do without you." Both generate that warm, intoxicating feeling of being needed, being seen, being essential to someone's life. But underneath, in the way each one operates on your nervous system, in what each one does to your sense of self over months and years, they are not the same thing at all. And if you are an empath, if you were born with the capacity to absorb other people's emotional states as though they were your own, if you naturally listen deeply, hold space generously, and offer comfort without asking for anything in return, then you are uniquely vulnerable to being drawn into a dynamic that looks like love from every angle, but functions as something far more complicated. Not a malicious kind of exploitation, not a calculated one, but the exploitation of someone who has never learned to heal themselves, and who, without fully realizing it, has turned you into their emotional infrastructure. They do not love you. They love how they feel when they are near you. They love the way you make them feel heard when no one else does. They love the way your presence quiets the anxiety they carry everywhere. They love the way you transform their worst days into something survivable. They love what you do for them, not who you are without them. And that distinction, as subtle as it might sound when spoken aloud, changes everything. Because when you love a person, you love them even when they have nothing left to give you. You love them on the days they are exhausted and silent. You love them when they pull away to recover. You love them when they say no. You love them when their presence no longer soothes you, when being with them requires something from you rather than offering you relief. But when someone is addicted to the healing another person carries, they do not love that person. They love something that person produces. And the moment that production changes, the moment the empath grows tired, grows quiet, grows boundaried, grows human, the love destabilizes. It becomes conditional. It curdles into distance, into resentment, into guilt-tripping, or into disappearance. And that is the moment you, the one who gave everything, begin to ask yourself, what did I do wrong? What changed in me? Why does love always seem to fall apart the moment I stop performing it? The answer is not in you. The answer is in the nature of what was never love to begin with. To understand why this keeps happening, why you specifically seem to attract people who consume rather than reciprocate, you have to go beneath behavior and into biology. The empath's nervous system is not wired like the average person's. Research in neuroscience points to a phenomenon called mirror neuron hyperactivity, where certain individuals process the emotional states of others with significantly greater intensity than the norm. When someone near you is in pain, your body does not simply register that information intellectually, it feels it. Your nervous system runs a near-identical simulation of that person's suffering inside your own body, often before your conscious mind has even formed a thought about it. This is not metaphor. This is measurable neurological activity. What this means in practice is that you have spent your entire life walking into rooms and immediately, involuntarily, reading the emotional temperature of everyone in it. You felt your mother's unspoken anxiety before she spoke a word. You sensed the tension between two people who were pretending everything was fine. You absorbed the grief of a friend who was smiling on the outside. And because your system is wired to detect distress with such precision, it is also wired, through years of learned behavior, often beginning in childhood, to respond to that distress, to soothe it, to fix it, to make it stop, partly because you genuinely care, and partly because carrying someone else's unresolved pain in your own body is physically uncomfortable. This is where the pattern begins. At some point very early in life, many empaths learned that the fastest way to regulate their own nervous system was to regulate the emotions of the people around them. If the room felt tense, you lightened it. If someone seemed withdrawn, you reached out. If someone was drowning in chaos, you became the calm. Not because you were asked to, but because your system had learned, through repetition and reward, that emotional harmony around you meant safety for you. Psychologists call this overfunctioning. It is a survival pattern, not a personality flaw. It is what happens when a deeply sensitive child grows up in an environment where the emotional needs of adults were louder than the emotional needs of the child, and where the child learned to tend to others as a way of managing their own inner world. Now carry that pattern into adulthood. Carry it into friendships, into romantic relationships, into workplaces. What happens? You become extraordinarily good at making other people feel safe. And people who have never felt safe, people who carry deep attachment wounds, unprocessed childhood pain, or a chronic inability to self-soothe, will find you magnetic. Not because they see you clearly, but because being near you feels like relief. Being near you quiets something in them that nothing else quiets. And that feeling, powerful, immediate, and unlike anything a typical relationship provides, gets misidentified by them, sometimes even by you. It gets called love, but what it actually is, in clinical terms, is co-regulation dependency. They are using your nervous system to regulate their own. They are borrowing your emotional stability because they have not yet built any of their own. And as long as you remain available, as long as you continue overfunctioning, continue absorbing, continue showing up with your full capacity while they show up with their full need, the arrangement feels like connection. It feels like connection because it produces the neurochemical signatures of connection. Oxytocin, dopamine, the warm weight of being needed. For you, there is meaning in the caretaking. For them, there is relief in being cared for. And for a time, both of you call this love. The fracture only becomes visible when you begin to change. When your capacity diminishes, not because you are failing, but because you are human, and human systems were never designed to give without limit. The dynamic shifts. You begin to have days when you cannot hold space, when you need to be held instead, when your silence is not an offering but a necessity. And the person who has been drawing from your well, who has structured their emotional life around your availability, experiences this not as your need but as your withdrawal, as your abandonment, as proof that you no longer love them. Because from inside a co-regulation dependency, a boundary feels like betrayal. And this is the moment, the precise, often devastating moment, when you realize that what was between you was never an exchange. It was a transaction, one in which only one party was ever truly paying. You were not loved for who you are. You were valued for what your nervous system could produce. And the cruelest part of this particular kind of pain is that it takes so long to see because it was wrapped so convincingly in the language of love. The moment you begin to change, the moment something deep and tired inside you finally says enough, you will not be met with understanding, not at first, not by the people who have been living off the warmth you produced. What you will be met with instead is friction, and that friction will be loud, and it will be personal, and if you are not prepared for it, it will convince you that you were wrong to change at all. You will be called cold, you will be called distant. You will be told that you have changed, as though change were an accusation, as though the person you were before, the one who gave endlessly and asked for nothing, was the correct and only acceptable version of you. People who once praised your warmth will suddenly question your character. People who leaned on you for years without once asking how you were doing will, the moment you become less available, describe you as selfish, as difficult, as someone who used to care but clearly no longer does. And here is what you need to understand about that reaction. Not to excuse it, but to see it clearly. It has very little to do with you. When an empath begins to establish boundaries, to speak less, to give less, to show up differently, the people who depended on their overfunctioning do not experience this as the empath's healing. They experience it as a mirror being held up to their own unmet needs. Your withdrawal does not just change the dynamic between you. It exposes something they have been avoiding. It forces into visibility the void they had been filling with your energy rather than their own inner work. And that exposure is deeply uncomfortable. For some people, it is intolerable, so they redirect the discomfort. They turn it outward. They make your boundary about their pain, and in doing so, they make you responsible for a wound you did not create and cannot heal. This is the mechanism beneath the guilt tripping, the cold shoulder, the sudden revision of your entire character. People do not resent the empath for being too much. They resent the empath for no longer being enough to keep their avoidance comfortable, enough to keep their unexamined patterns undisturbed, enough to keep the arrangement running in a way that costs only one person. There is a particular kind of person who is especially reactive to the empath's awakening. Not the openly narcissistic ones. Those are often easier to identify over time. The harder ones are the people who genuinely believe they loved you, who would pass a lie detector test saying they cared, because they did care, about the relief you gave them, about the safety your presence manufactured, about the version of themselves they got to be when you were absorbing everything they could not carry. These are not villains. They are wounded people who never developed the interior resources to hold their own pain, and who, perhaps entirely unconsciously, found in you a living substitute for that capacity. When you stop substituting, they do not grieve the relationship. They grieve the regulation. They grieve the relief. And because they cannot yet distinguish between those two things, they call it love. They call your boundary a betrayal of love. And you, because you are an empath, because your nervous system is finely tuned to the suffering of others, because you have spent a lifetime taking responsibility for emotional climates you did not create, will feel the pull to apologize, to soften, to explain yourself in ways that make their discomfort smaller, to go back to who you were before, because who you were before at least kept the peace. But the peace you kept was not peace. It was suppression wearing the mask of harmony. What looked like closeness was one person endlessly expanding to accommodate another's inability to grow. What looked like love was a system designed, however unconsciously, to keep you giving and keep them receiving indefinitely, without renegotiation. The anger they show you when you change is not evidence that you have done something wrong. It is evidence that the arrangement is ending. And arrangements, especially ones that have been mistaken for love, do not end quietly. There is something else worth naming here, something that the empath rarely hears and needs to hear. The intensity of someone's reaction to your boundary is directly proportional to how much they were depending on you not to have one. The louder the protest, the deeper the dependency. The more they frame your self-preservation as cruelty, the more clearly it reveals how little space was ever made for your needs within what they called a relationship. You did not make them feel that way by changing. You made them visible, and visibility, for someone who has built their emotional life around the invisible labor of another, feels like destruction. Let it. Not because you wish them harm, but because you understand now, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that you cannot heal someone who is using you as a substitute for healing. You can only make yourself endlessly available to be consumed. And that is not love either. That is self-erasure, dressed in the language of compassion. The friction you are feeling right now, the discomfort in the room, the strange guilt of simply deciding to take up space in your own life, that is not evidence of your failure. That is the sound of a dynamic that was never healthy finally meeting its limit. And the limit is you, standing still, asking for nothing except the right to exist without performance. There comes a moment, and if you are reading this, you may already be standing inside it, when something fundamental shifts. Not dramatically. Not with a speech or a confrontation or a clean cinematic breaking point. It shifts quietly, like a door closing softly in a room you have spent years trying to keep open for everyone else. It is the moment you stop explaining yourself, not because you have given up, not because you have hardened into someone unfeeling, but because you have finally, at great cost and after great patience, understood something that no one taught you when you were young and pouring yourself into every person who looked thirsty. You are not responsible for the emotional survival of people who never took responsibility for their own. This is the awakening, and it does not arrive as anger. In an empath, it almost never does. It arrives as exhaustion that has finally been given permission to be honest. It arrives as a stillness you stop apologizing for. It arrives as the quiet, unshakable recognition that the life you have been living, the one built around availability, around emotional labor, around being the person everyone calls at midnight but no one thinks to check on at noon, that life was not intimacy, It was service. And you were never hired, you were simply expected. The boundaries that emerge from this place are not walls. This is the distinction that matters most, and it is the one most frequently misunderstood, both by the people who resent your limits and sometimes by the part of you that still feels guilty for having them. A wall is built to punish. A wall says, "You hurt me, so now I will make myself unreachable." A wall is reactive. It is constructed in anger and maintained in pride. It keeps everything out, including the things worth letting in. A boundary is entirely different. A boundary is built from discernment. It is not a statement about the other person's worth. It is a statement about your own capacity. It says, I know what I can hold, and I know what I cannot. I know which connections restore me and which ones quietly dismantle me, and I am no longer willing to confuse depletion with devotion. Boundaries for the empath are not the opposite of love. They are the precondition for it. Because without them, what you offer is not love. It is chronic overfunctioning with love's name written on the outside. And what is received is not love either. It is consumption, dressed in gratitude, until the gratitude runs out. When you begin to hold your boundary, when you begin to choose silence over endless explanation, when you stop showing up to every emotional emergency as though your absence would be catastrophic, you will notice something. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full. It is full of you, of your thoughts that do not belong to anyone else, of your energy that has not been redistributed before you even had the chance to feel it, of your nervous system, perhaps for the first time in years, operating at a frequency that is actually yours. This is what sovereignty feels like. Not power over others. Power returned to yourself. And the silence, the one people will call coldness, will call withdrawal, will call a sign that something is wrong with you. That silence is discernment in its purest form. It is the pause between stimulus and response that distinguishes a person who is healing from a person who is still reacting. It is the space in which you finally get to ask, does this connection align with who I am becoming, or does it only work when I am who I used to be? Because that is the question at the center of everything. So many relationships, and you may be grieving one right now or several, only function when the empath remains unconscious, when you do not yet know what you know, when you are still willing to perform the labor of two people's emotional lives and call it love. The moment you become conscious, the moment you begin to require reciprocity, the moment you stop absorbing what is not yours to carry, those relationships reveal their actual architecture. And sometimes the architecture cannot hold what you now need it to hold. That grief is real. Do not let anyone minimize it. Losing a relationship you believed in, even one that was never fully what you thought it was, is a real loss. Discovering that someone who called you their person was, in fact, loving the feeling you produced in them rather than the person who produced it. That is a specific, disorienting kind of sorrow. It calls into question not just that one relationship, but the entire catalog. Every moment that felt like love, every sacrifice that felt like intimacy, every time you stayed up late absorbing someone else's crisis and told yourself this was what it meant to care. It was not wrong of you to care. That is the thing you must hold on to, even as everything else is being re-examined. Your capacity for depth, for presence, for genuine attunement to the inner world of another person. None of that was a mistake. None of that made you naive or foolish or broken. It made you rare. And rare things are frequently mistaken for resources by people who have not yet learned to cultivate their own. The mistake, if it can even be called that, was not in your caring. It was in the absence of alignment, in giving your deepest gifts to connections that were not designed to receive them with care, in staying in dynamics where your presence was essential but your personhood was optional. In calling that love because it was the closest thing to love you had been shown was possible. You are allowed to want more than that now. You are allowed to require that the people in your life see you, not just feel better because of you. You are allowed to let silence be your answer when no words feel sufficient. You are allowed to move slowly, to choose carefully, to no longer fill every room you walk into with your own light just because the room happens to be dark. That is not selfishness, that is sovereignty. And it took you longer to claim it than it should have, not because you were weak, but because you were taught in 100 small and large ways that your worth lived in your usefulness, that to be loved was to be needed, that to stop giving was to stop deserving. None of that was ever true.